So what's going on here? In actuality, it's quite a few things, because there are several fundamental problems with our economic and governmental institutions as they stand now. Let's start by dissecting the problems of capitalism. Capitalism at its core is an expansionist economic philosophy. More businesses peddling more products to more consumers, more money circulating in more banks, and bigger institutions supporting all of these things. In effect, it's the economic equivalent of a Katamari, adding more to its repertoire and growing bigger with each move forward. When kept in check by human ethics and common sense, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Katamari can be a lot of fun. However, as capitalist nations have become larger in scope, those human ethics and that common sense seem to have diminished somewhat. As a result, capitalist nations are plagued by problems of income inequality and environmental degradation. Let's go back to our initial example of the Great Recession. The abuse of subprime mortgages that led to the recession was only allowed to continue as it did because banks were making huge profits selling them in bundles, known as mortgage-backed securities, not caring whether the underlying loans defaulted. As a result, millions lost their homes when they couldn't afford to pay the mortgages that they had been improperly loaned out, and the banks themselves lost millions as well. When the time came to bail out the big banks, the burden of paying for them fell square on ordinary taxpayers. As a result, the rich got rich and the poor got poorer. For a more concrete example, Bloomberg, in December of 2014, reported that the world's wealthiest billionaires had a combined net worth of $4.1 trillion. That's more than the entire GDP of Spain the same year, concentrated in slightly fewer hands than it would take to fill this auditorium. By contrast, the average American that year had to make do with an annual income closer to $50,000. Furthermore, as capitalist businesses grow larger to meet larger market demands, they consume more resources and take up more space. The Volkswagen plant in Wolfsburg, for example, by no means an atypical example of this type of factory, takes up 6,500,000 square feet of space. That's about 867 soccer fields, and consumes countless resources to produce its cars. The trouble is, we've only got so much space and so many resources as it is. And with a population of 7.4 billion and climbing, we're already putting a considerable strain on those resources. Thanks to industrial pollution, environmental degradation, and other problems linked in part to industrial growth, climatologists agree that we are past the point of no return for 2 degrees Celsius of global warming, leading to problems ranging from rising sea levels to falling crop yields. This is outright ignoring when businesses outright make mistakes, such as the Deepwater Horizon oil spill of 2010. That particular tragedy impacted 16,000 miles of coastline, devastating marine ecosystems and coastal industries alike. But against the mentality of unchecked growth, environmental concerns are often ignored or outright disparaged, even when they're inhibiting that same growth capitalism is trying to provide, or they could negatively impact the entire world. In all fairness, it's not like people haven't realized that problems with capitalism exist. Socialism was developed as an alternate school of thought in response to similar criticisms against capitalism, dating all the way back to the late 1700s. While capitalism, as we've seen, prefers to build outward, socialism prefers to stretch its resources and build inward, providing valuable benefits such as government health care and national infrastructure through higher government intervention. When kept in check by common sense, this isn't a bad thing either. However, socialist economic systems have one crucial flaw that can take entire governments and nations down with them: overextension. Socialist systems rely extensively on government support to provide for the needs and wants of their citizens, and that government support is in turn supported by government money. That money is usually provided by higher taxes on typical citizens. In smaller, homogeneous nations, this isn't usually a problem. People are more willing to tolerate higher tax burdens due to national solidarity and the trust in their government. And the benefits that those taxes pay for are more readily visible to the general public, further reinforcing that same trust. However, the major proponent of socialism in the modern world is not one small, homogeneous nation, but rather the entire European Union, a heavily economically enmeshed network of 28 nations, 518 million people, and about 1.9 million square miles. The sheer amount of resources needed to maintain infrastructure across these territories is staggering, and it all has to come from somewhere. But rather than tax their already burdened citizens, European governments chose to handle their particular problems by resorting to huge borrowing, which led to huge debt, which led to the same austerity measures I mentioned earlier. Other concerns with socialism involve not what it does, but what it doesn't do. Whereas capitalist systems at their core provide incentives for unchecked economic growth, Socialist systems fail to provide any incentives for economic growth at all. In capitalist systems, businesses and individuals alike have to adapt to meet the needs of the marketplace. Those that do survive and thrive, and those that fail summarily die out. This is not so in a socialist system. Rather, because of extensive government support, businesses and individuals alike have no reason to meet the needs or wants of the marketplace. Should they stumble, the government will simply prop them back up because it values them and sees them as necessary, although the average consumer might not agree. This was a massive problem in the centrally planned economies of the Soviet Union, and to a lesser extent continues to plague the nations of Europe to this day. Furthermore, favoring socialism has no net positive impact on the environment on its own, with socialist nations polluting just as much as their capitalist contemporaries. So clearly, this system is also untenable in its current state. Capitalism and socialism alike, despite their many and substantial differences, are failing the public right now for one shared reason. Like Godzilla and King Kong seen here in their usual rampage through the city, the institutions they support are just too big. For historical context, the Roman Empire, considered one of the greatest in the world, consisted of 1.93 million square miles in which resided 60 million people in its peak years. That empire got chopped in half in 395 AD, simply because it had become too unwieldy and big for one emperor to manage on his own. By contrast, the present-day United States houses 318 million people over 3.8 million square miles, 6 times the population and twice the landmass of the Roman Empire. And its government is still carrying that weight on its own. So what can be done to prevent history from repeating itself? The answer is deceptively simple. We need to go smaller. On the level of the mainstream, this idea hasn't been a popular one, for understandable reasons. To opponents of the notion, going small would necessitate giving up some very important things. Large-scale economic and social institutions have their problems, sure, but they've also provided opportunities for scientific and technological advancement, cheap and readily available consumer goods, and efficient and widely distributed medicine. This isn't even accounting for the smaller day-to-day benefits such systems provide, such as being able to drive to work or take longer showers in the morning. Who is going to provide all of these things in the event of a mass societal compartmentalization? Should this scenario come to pass, critics argue, society could face a severe regression, possibly by decades. However, they neglect to mention that this outcome is by no means an inevitable one. I'm here today to posit an alternate scenario, a hypothetical best-case outcome in the event of a global downsizing. The first assumption that critics of global downsizing make is that the goods produced in the new local communities would be inferior somehow in terms of availability, price, or quality to those produced now in large-scale markets. This is not necessarily true. To illustrate this point, let's look at 2 classes of basic essential goods, food and medicine. Although it is true, in the event of global downsizing, that the factory farms which feed the world's masses would likely disappear, the crops and livestock that they raise and peddle out would not. In fact, what would more likely happen is a resurgence in local farms and farmers' markets, due to no longer being outcompeted economically by larger agricultural collectives, which can pump out cheaper, albeit shoddier, products in larger quantities. While the food itself would be limited in terms of selection by climate and geography, this is something that happens even in large-scale farming, and trade between communities could correct the issue to a degree. Furthermore, the food itself would be of higher quality due to producers no longer having an incentive to cut corners to meet quotas, and due to closer interaction between consumers and producers available at largely the level of supply that consumers need. Meanwhile, a significant portion of modern medicine is composed of chemical compounds found naturally occurring in plants, synthesized and distributed and peddled out by large corporations, often at outrageous prices, as the case of Martin Shkreli so many months ago so tactfully demonstrated. Now, in local communities, these same plants could be grown, their chemicals synthesized, and the results distributed by typical community members at a much lower and probably fairer market price. Keep in mind, though, and this should go without saying, that herbal medicine cannot replace everything. You can't replicate the effects of X-rays, fMRIs, or pacemakers, to name a few very important things, with plants alone. Even in a best-case scenario, and I cannot stress this point strongly enough, there will be trade-offs. On a lighter note, though, goods that can't be produced directly by farming can be provided for through other means. For instance, clothing can be passed down through generations, as your grandfather's suit still taking up closet space can attest, or hand-woven using traditional techniques and naturally occurring fibers. Cars can be powered by biodiesel and shared amongst community members. In a sense, this is already happening on a larger scale with services like Uber. And electrical power can be obtained through more sustainable sources, such as solar panels, which, while unprofitable or undesirable to large nations and corporations in the present time, can be installed and maintained for a much lower cost in local communities. Now wait a minute, you may be thinking. Sure, you can grow your own food in theory, provide your own power in theory. It's all very nice, in theory. But the average Joe doesn't have a lick of an idea on how to operate all of these complex systems. So how are they going to stay on their feet, should the scenario come to pass? To this I have a one-word reply, and please bear with me on this point. Internet. Already a force for global connection, the internet could not only connect disparate local communities, but also act as an intellectual reservoir, providing individuals and individual communities alike with the resources they need to get up on their feet at all. Keep in mind, though, that the internet is not indestructible, much as we'd like to think it is. And its continued existence would necessitate some communities building themselves around cell towers and routers, acting as the system's protectors and maintenance crew. Given that these communities would be functionally identical in every other respect to similar communities outside, and few in the modern world would be willing to give up their internet connection, this is not an unreasonable assumption to make. Furthermore, it's not like a global downsizing would suddenly kill off all of our scientists, engineers, and other experts. In fact, they may prove more valued and useful than ever. Currently, 7.2% of college graduates are unemployed, while a further 14.9% are underemployed, working at jobs below their skill level due to tight labor markets across the nation. In essence, there are far too many people competing for far too few jobs. Local communities would not have this overcrowding issue, and if they could adapt to the lifestyle, these same graduates could find themselves with steady work and a vital role in their circles. The fundamental strength of local communities in global downsizing, though, is not in their ability to provide all of these advantages, but in a part of their nature that gives them that ability. And to understand it, we need to go back to some Enlightenment philosophy. In 1762, Jean-Jacques Rousseau posited that societies form through social contracts. In a social contract, individuals ceded some of their rights, such as the right to steal from others, to a central authority that they trusted. In turn, that authority would safeguard the remaining rights and well-being of the people that trusted it. As long as citizens and authorities trusted each other enough to hold up their ends of the bargain, the system held. And when that trust was breached, it fell apart and a new authority took over. Sounds simple enough, but Rousseau forgot one crucial problem: scale. As nations and national governments become larger, they can't always respond directly to the needs of the people. And when they don't have a ground view, they can't always ascertain what those needs are either. Governments tried to respond by expanding in scope, developing complex webs of bureaucracy, and segmenting their responsibilities across multiple smaller agencies. Not only did this not help the general public, because the government had become so nebulous and abstract, they became unable to correct it when it was acting contrary to their needs and wants. Furthermore, because government responsibilities had become so segmented, even individuals on the inside couldn't do much to change for the better. This is one of the reasons that individuals such as Stephen Eisman, who foresaw the 2008 housing market collapse, could do nothing to prevent it, nor could they prevent the practices that caused it to occur in the first place. Large-scale governments and the financial institutions that support them lack accountability. In local communities, lack of accountability is not an issue. By nature, the people will know their leaders very well and can communicate with them directly, making social contracts that much easier to enforce. The people will appoint a leader that they trust, as the survivors did with Rick Grimes in The Walking Dead, show I'm sure many of you have seen. And that leader will in turn be directly accountable to the rest of the community. Furthermore, citizens will have a greater impetus to perform their civic duties in their communities when they have a personal investment in their home and its leadership. Now keep in mind that human nature does not change that easily. And inevitably, there will be corrupt leaders and disgruntled citizens. Should such problems arise, though, they can be swiftly corrected by the rest of the community, again due to how close-knit it is. And in the worst-case scenario, when someone flat out does not agree with the community's or its leader's ideology, they can simply transition to another one. Because of our burgeoning population, in the event of a global downsizing, the amount of communities present to choose from would be essentially limitless. Now, despite the many advantages of local communities, as I've described, transitioning to them would involve some major challenges. Mass production would be a thing of the past, meaning that consumer goods would become scarcer by default. Citizens would have to adopt skill sets that they would otherwise have had no clue about to adapt to their new lifestyle. For instance, basic agriculture. In the event of trade between communities, currency exchanges could become flat-out nightmarish without a unified system. And in the case of crime, legal matters could fall into the same trap. In fact, at the present time, the logistics of inter-community transport and communication are rather fuzzy. These setbacks haven't stopped some from jumping in ahead of the bandwagon, however. Already, local communities are springing out across the United States with names like the Dancing Rabbit Eco Village seen here or the Windy Corner Farm, espousing the virtues of community and sustainability and relying mostly on agriculture. Some of these communities have been wildly successful. Others have vanished into the ether. But to describe all of them would require an entire separate presentation. And let's face it, you guys are looking kind of bored as it is. The point is, the impulse is there. So do I personally advocate from switching from our behemoth nations and national coalitions to more sustainable, robust local communities? In the short run, no. And don't look so surprised about it. Establishing and running the sort of communities I've been describing would require a considerable effort, not just from individuals, but entire nations, that simply isn't there on a scale that it needs to be. Even the alternative communities that exist in the present time rely to some degree on the infrastructure that larger nations provide. Ironically, going small in earnest would require a global effort, not only to establish countermeasures for possible negative side effects, but also to educate citizens in the new skill sets they need, as I've said, to lead such a lifestyle. However, in the long run, do I think that global downsizing is a good idea? Definitely. As demonstrated, local communities have several fundamental advantages over larger nations when done right, economically, socially, and politically. The mere fact that there are alternative communities up and running at all demonstrates that the idea has potential. We may not be completely ready to deliver on that potential yet, but given enough time and enough preparation, we could very well be. For now, it's heartening to know, for those who are burned on today's economic and political leadership, that there is an alternative. Thank you.